The price of rain. In the small coastal town of Bayview, North Carolina, the summer of 2025 was a season of frayed nerves and restless skies. Hurricane Alara had torn through the Carolinas a week earlier, leaving behind shattered homes, flooded streets, and a community clinging to the hope of federal aid. The storm's wrath had spared no one, not the fishermen who lost their boats, not the shopkeepers whose storefronts were reduced to splintered wood, not even the old oak tree that had stood in the town square for a century, now uprooted like a monument to better days. Clara Hensley, a single mother of two, stood in her kitchen, staring at a letter from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. The paper trembled in her hands, not from fear but from fury. Her home, a modest two-bedroom rental, had a hole in the roof where Alara's winds had ripped away shingles and beams. Rainwater still dripped into buckets scattered across the living room. Her kids, Mia and Jonah, were staying with her sister in Raleigh until Clara could make the house livable again. But the letter in her hand wasn't the promise of relief she'd been praying for. It was something else entirely, a demand. The letter outlined a new condition for disaster relief funds. To receive aid, Bayview, like every other town and state, had to certify that it would not sever commercial relations specifically with Israeli companies. Clara's brow furrowed as she read the words again, trying to make sense of them. Why was this in a FEMA letter? What did Israel have to do with rebuilding her roof, with getting her kids back home, with saving her town from drowning in debt and despair? She'd heard of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS, they called it, a campaign to pressure Israel over its policies toward Palestinians. She didn't know much about it, only snippets from news reports and heated debates on X. But she knew Bayview's town council had passed a resolution last year, a symbolic gesture supporting BDS, mostly because a local activist group had pushed for it after the war in Gaza escalated in 2023. Clara set the letter down and rubbed her temples. She wasn't political. She didn't have the luxury of ideology. Her days were spent working double shifts at the diner, scraping together enough to keep Mia in dance lessons and Jonah in new sneakers. But this letter felt like a punch to the gut, a choice between principles she barely understood and the survival of her family. If Bayview didn't comply, the town would lose $2 million in FEMA grants, money meant for search and rescue equipment, emergency manager salaries, and backup power systems. Money that could fix her roof, her neighbor's flooded basement, the town's crumbling pier. Money that could bring her kids home. She grabbed her phone and scrolled through X, searching for news. Posts were already flooding in, some outraged, some triumphant. Trump ties disaster aid to Israel loyalty test, one user wrote. Unconstitutional, another shouted. A third, from a conservative account, declared, good. No aid for anti-Semites. Clara's head spun. By noon, the news was everywhere. The Trump administration had announced the policy on August 4, 2025, linking $1.9 billion in federal aid to a rejection of boycotts against Israeli companies. The Department of Homeland Security, which oversaw FEMA, called it a stand against discriminatory prohibited boycotts. But the backlash was swift. By evening, the policy was gone, erased from the DHS website as if it had never existed. No FEMA requirement tied to Israel, a spokesperson claimed, denying the policy had ever been real. Clara didn't care about the reversal. The damage was done. The letter was still in her hand, and the town council was meeting tonight to decide what to do. Bayview's mayor, a gruff former fisherman named Tom Hargrove, had called an emergency session. Clara wasn't one for meetings, but she pulled on her raincoat and headed to the community center, her boots splashing through puddles that refused to dry. The community center was packed, the air thick with tension and the smell of damp wood. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of anxious residents. Tom stood at the front, his weathered face grim as he held up a copy of the FEMA letter. Folks, he said, his voice hoarse, we've got a choice to make. We can stick to our resolution, keep our pride, and lose the aid. Or we can sign this certification, get the money, and rebuild. I don't like it any more than you do, but we need to be practical. The room erupted. Sarah Nguyen, the activist who'd spearheaded the BDS resolution, stood up, her voice sharp. This is coercion. They're holding our survival hostage to force us into a political stance we don't all agree with. Bayview voted for that resolution because we believe in human rights, in standing up for what's right. If we cave now, what's next? What else will they demand we sacrifice? Clara's neighbor, Marcus Tate, a mechanic whose garage had flooded, shot back. Human rights don't fix my shop, Sarah. They don't feed my kids. You want to talk about conscience? How about the conscience of letting this town rot because of a symbolic vote nobody outside Bayview cares about? The argument escalated, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Clara stayed quiet, her mind racing. She thought of Mia's smile when she nailed a pirouette, of Jonah's laugh when he scored a goal in soccer. She thought of the buckets in her living room, the mold creeping up the walls. She thought of freedom. Not the kind Sarah talked about, but the freedom to live without fear of the next storm, the next bill, the next impossible choice. As the meeting dragged on, Clara's thoughts drifted to her late father, a man who'd spent his life on fishing boats, loyal to the sea even when it betrayed him. He'd taught her about loyalty, not to causes or flags, but to the people you love, the ones who depend on you. But he'd also taught her about conscience, about the quiet voice that tells you what's right, even when it's inconvenient. Clara wondered what he'd say now, caught between loyalty to her kids and a conscience she wasn't sure she could afford. By the time the meeting ended, the council had voted 4-3 to sign the certification. Sarah stormed out, vowing to fight it in court. Marcus clapped Tom on the shoulder, relieved. Clara walked home alone, the rain starting again, a soft drizzle that felt like the sky was weeping. She didn't know if the council's decision was right or wrong. All she knew was that the aid would come now, and maybe, just maybe, she could fix her roof before the next storm hit. But the story didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, Bayview became a microcosm of a divided nation. The FEMA letter, though rescinded, had left a scar. Ex-posts kept the debate alive, with some calling it a victory for pragmatism, others a betrayal of principle. Sarah and her group filed a lawsuit, arguing the policy, even briefly enforced, violated the First Amendment. The Council on American Islamic Relations called it patently unconstitutional, warning that tying aid to political stances could set a dangerous precedent. Clara followed the news, but it felt distant, like a storm on someone else's horizon. Her world was smaller, the roofers who finally came, the sound of Mia and Jonah laughing in their own beds again, the slow return of normalcy. Yet normalcy was fragile. One night, Clara found Jonah sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. He was 12, old enough to sense the weight of things. "Mom," he asked, "did we do the right thing? Signing that paper?" Clara hesitated. She wanted to tell him it was simple, that survival always came first. But she remembered her father's voice, the one that spoke of conscience. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said finally. "Sometimes you have to choose between what keeps you standing and what lets you sleep at night. We chose to stand. I hope we can still sleep." Jonah nodded, but his eyes stayed on the stars, searching for something Clara couldn't name. She wondered if this was the real cost of the FEMA letter, not just the money or the politics, but the questions it planted in a boy's heart, the doubts it sowed in a town's soul. Bayview would rebuild, but it would carry the weight of that choice, a reminder that even in a democracy, freedom came with strings, and loyalty was a currency spent at a price. The weeks turned to months, and the nation moved on. The FEMA policy became a footnote, overshadowed by new headlines, tariffs, immigration raids, redistricting battles. But in Bayview, the memory lingered. Clara saw it in the way Sarah avoided her at the diner, in the way Marcus bragged about his new equipment but never met her eyes. She saw it in the town square, where the old oak stump still stood, a silent witness to the storm and its aftermath. One day, Clara drove to the pier, rebuilt with FEMA funds, its planks gleaming under the autumn sun. She stood at the edge, watching the waves crash against the pilings. The ocean was calm now, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way. Another storm would come, another choice, another test. She thought of the FEMA letter, of the council's vote, of Jonah's question. She thought of freedom, not the kind in speeches or slogans, but the kind that let you stand on a pier, breathe salt air, and believe you could face whatever came next. Clara didn't have answers. She didn't know if Bayview had betrayed its conscience or saved its soul. But as she watched the horizon, she felt a flicker of hope, not in policies or promises, but in the stubborn resilience of people like her, who kept going, who kept choosing, even when the choices broke their hearts. The story of Bayview was a story of America in 2025, a nation caught in the crosshairs of political gambits and moral dilemmas. On August 4, 2025, the Trump administration had tried to tie disaster relief to a loyalty test, a move that sparked outrage and debate before being quietly erased. It was a fleeting policy, but its ripples reached places like Bayview, where ordinary people grappled with the cost of survival. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, targeted by the policy, was a lightning rod for deeper questions about justice, power, and the price of taking a stand. For Clara, for Jonah, for Bayview, the storm wasn't just in the sky. It was in the choices they made, the loyalties they honored, and the consciences they carried into an uncertain future. This story uses the real-world event as a catalyst to explore the emotional and symbolic toll of political decisions on a small community. It weaves in themes of freedom, the tension between personal and political freedoms, loyalty to family, community, and principles, conscience versus survival, the moral cost of pragmatic choices, and the broader impact of top-down policies on ordinary lives. The narrative aims to inform readers about the August 4, 2025, event while inviting reflection on its implications, encouraging discussion about the intersection of politics, morality, and resilience. If you'd like to adjust the tone, expand specific sections, or focus on different characters or themes, let me know.